Hi friends, I'm Jeffy G, and I'm not afraid to admit that I am an FM synthesis junkie, and there's no 12-step program that's going to get me off this train. Only recently that I've come to realize how much I was influenced by FM synthesis when Yamaha came out with the DX7 in '83. Yeah, I had one of those synths. Still do. I played it a lot, and not just cover songs that were popular at the time, but I continued to use presets and new sound sources well into the 90s because I like the sound so much. Meanwhile, there's a parallel between FM synthesis and Star Trek that you might not realize. You see, Gene Roddenberry created Star Trek way back in the early 60s, but it's been reincarnated over and over again. It has a certain persistence where it makes a comeback about every 5 years with a new cast and a new show and new movies. Well, FM synthesis is kind of the same. They're still releasing new FM synthesizers. The old ones are good, the new ones are great, and there's currently a bit of a renaissance around FM sounds. And I like them. I like the E-pianos that are not so natural. I like the organ sounds. I like the deep bass. I like the marimbas and the bells. When you combine all of these different sounds to make new things, you get something that sounds organic, but it's clearly synthesized, and it's not something you can easily create with an analog synth. In this video, I'm going to talk about the parallel between Star Trek and FM synthesis, and I'm also going to get you up to speed with the latest synths and tools that are out there. If you're like me, I think you'll find this pretty helpful. In the popular category, you've got things like Dexed, which is free, and popular because it's free, FM8 from Native Instruments, and Flow Motion from Waves. Some vendors are still making new FM virtual synths. One of the more popular ones is from the Arturia collection, the DX7 V. Easy transition if you're coming from a Yamaha DX7 to a virtual instrument. Two others to consider, FM by Tracktion and OP-X4 from Air Audio. These are a bit more sophisticated, multiple oscillator sources, and some new capabilities for filters and envelopes that we haven't seen added into the FM mix. Some lesser known or older FM options are EFM1 from Logic. I think that first came out in '93. Aux, a very nice FM synth, but it's Windows only, and I think it's free. Sugar Bytes is part of the mix too with Apparillo, which is available both for Mac and for iOS. Are there companies still making FM hardware? Yep, Yamaha DX7 is popular, the Korg OP-X is popular. I'm not going to list them all here because the focus of this video is really on the virtual FM synth. Here's my DX7, and you can see I played it a lot. Had a long time. I would not say it's in mint condition. Not everything works perfectly. You can see it has some battle damages from taking it to gigs, much like the Enterprise in Star Trek. By the mid-90s, I stopped taking this to gigs and I used Dexed, the virtual version of the DX7. It works great with a computer and main stage, and it's far easier to carry. My DX7 has 3 of these cartridges, so I had some variety of sound patches that I could use. If you're a Logic user, you would have got this FM synth called EFM1, which is pretty basic. It doesn't have a lot of presets. You'll see they're organized into leads, pads, keyboards, etc. But there's not a lot of them. And here's what it sounds like. If you go to some of the pads, you can get this calming sound. I mean, you can tell that it's FM. There's 2 modulators, one feeding the other, but it doesn't actually have all of the features of, a more modern FM synth. By comparison, you'd be a lot better off with Dexed. I'm not going to go through a full tutorial on how Dexed works, but at first glance, you've got this layout of all the algorithms and oscillators. You have up to 32 patches that you can have at any point in time. But the strength of Dexed is that it used the DX7 algorithms, and it had this great cart management capability. And you could download a file called 100 sysex files. You could play with what those sysex files did. So for example, here I've got B1, which was one of the cartridges. And if I select, one of the patches from that cartridge, and I could drag any one of those samples into this lower area that holds my 32 favorites. So let's say I was after a saw. There's a familiar DX7 sound. Now that I think about it, that download that you can get is this one called DX7 All the Web. And this has hundreds and hundreds of presets from different artists and programmers. Another more recognizable DX7 sound, anything marimba. You get to pick the ones that you use the most, 32 at a time. So if you were looking for something more authentic to the DX7, one option is the Arturia DX7 V, which is newer and constantly improved, but still based on the DX7. And it has those traditional sounds, which is awesome. Lots of E-pianos, pretty famous stuff. Great bass sounds. You can see they reference some of the brass instruments right from the cartridge that they used to come on. And the thing about these DX7 emulators is that the parallel in Star Trek world is the first series, the ones that came out in the 60s with Captain Kirk and that cast. And I think the Enterprise defined what the spaceship was, just the way the DX7 defines what sounds you expected to get out of FM synthesis. Now, the great thing about the Arturia DX7 V is it's the most evolved DX7 implementation. You have control over envelopes, modification matrix, and effects, and you've got, of course, tons of presets to choose from. The layout is easy to program, and it's got some really handy features if you're into sound design that the earlier models like the DX7 and the Dexed software are a little bit more difficult to handle. Now, for any FM synthesis junkie, the breakthrough, which came a few years later, was from Native Instruments with FM8, and it was delivered in the complete bundles, but you could also buy this independently, and most recently you can buy it for as little as $10. Well, these synthesis sounds really extended what FM could do. So you've got the browser overview with just hundreds of presets, but you've also got attributes for each one. You've got master controls for anything that you create. It has a separate effects layer, and actually you can use those effects built into FM8 with other instruments, not just the FM synthesis. You've got this great arpeggiator. You've got the ability to morph sounds. All of the capabilities around filtering and envelopes were built into this, and so this was breathing new life into an old concept. And I guess the parallel to that is when Star Trek came out with, really, it's Star Trek The Next Generation. And you could kind of think of FM8 as being the next generation of FM synthesis. You got a new captain, you got a new crew, and you've got a new spaceship. And in this case, the spaceship is the parallel to the synth. You'll see in the browser that not only do you have all the FM8 factory settings, but you've got its predecessor FM7. And you have this category of special effects, which is amazing, just using FM synthesis to generate sounds. But you've still got some of the classics. So without going through a full demo of all the presets and how FM8 works, suffice to say that for me, this would breathe new life into FM synthesis. The Native Instruments FM8 synth was the first to use this metaphor on the right here, where you see one oscillator feeding frequency modulation information into another. And this diagram actually becomes pretty standard going forward in other synths. The ability to control all these parameters, the effects, the arpeggiator, all of these features created a renaissance. And I'm still using FM8 today. And much like Star Trek, I think Star Trek The Next Generation actually breathed new life into an old franchise. Just one more quick thing about FM8 is you can import those sysex files that came with Dexed. So if there's any sound patches or any groups of 32 in those carts that you want to bring in, you can load them into FM8 and use that as your launch point. So you really don't need to use Dexed anymore. I just think that feature is amazing that this is compatible with those old sysex files. Another new modern take on FM synthesis comes from Flow Motion by Waves. And this graphically looks a little bit different because it includes 4 oscillators that can modulate each other through these connections. And you can see each oscillator has some unique attributes. You can choose type of oscillation and the way it's connected, and they can all flow through this middle ground. All the attributes of each of those oscillators is on the right, and you have the ability to have multiple patterns, up to 16 down at the bottom. One of the newer FM synthesizers that impressed me was OP-X4 by Air Audio, and this gets delivered some different ways. It's most popular being used with the MPC devices, and you can buy it through a Kai, or you could just get the plug-in and it'll work in any DAW like you see here. The layout is interesting, and here's a diagram to show you just the separation of the global controls, the FM operators, the filters, and the modulation. In a simple way, it's a 4-operator FM synthesis with up to 32 modulation points. It has 2 LFOs, 2 filters, and some extensive envelope capabilities in effect. Here's what it sounds like. They've done a nice job on this of providing preview presets. I would hazard a guess that these are their best sounding presets. So let's just take a listen to one. Digital wind chime. And you can turn off these operators. So if you turn off the first 3, okay, add the other ones. So I think you get the idea. You can control the level, formant, all the parameters, but this matrix over here is perhaps the unique piece where you can determine the amount of shaping and how it's applied. And this is where your filters and the LFO and everything come into play. If you click on the mix and effects, you'll see there's details of how each one of those operators will feed into this section below called the bus mix. At the top, you've got macros, which are assignable, but if you're using presets, one of the things you may find frustrating is that none of the macros are labeled. In the middle section, you've got your filters, your LFOs, and utilities. At the bottom, you see the first 16 modulators, and you can choose what those modulators do. That's the first 16, and then there's another 16. So extensive modulation capabilities, and we've seen in other FM synthesizers where you feed the results of one operator and its modulation into another. This is just a new take on the same idea, but it's a nice layout. There's a classic FM e-piano. Is it any better than other FM synthesizers that are out there? Well, that's debatable. There are more capabilities here. It is similar sounds to what you have heard from other FM synthesizers that I've demoed so far. It is new, the preset library is more extensive, and all of those modulators do give you some flexibility that other synths may be more limited to. The company Tracktion has a new FM synthesizer called F, M, and it sounds pretty good. And I like the layout of this thing. It's pretty simple. It's got all your operators, 11 of them, on the left here, and you choose what you see on the right based on what's selected on the left. You can turn off or on oscillators 1 through 8 with these on-off buttons, and you can control things like the frequency and the details of that oscillator. There are 4 layers, which is kind of cool, and you can click on those layers, or you can go back to the FM mod matrix, which is something we've seen in earlier synths, which shows you that the output from, say, oscillator 1 is going into F1, which is a noise operator. Nice layout, simple to understand. It has effects. There's quite a list of effects that are built in that you can use. You can have up to 4 layers of effects, each with an on-off switch. You've got some high-level ADSR controls down at the bottom here. And then lastly, you've got an arpeggiator that you can turn on if you... So basically everything is there. Everything that you would expect of a modern synthesizer is there. It's all FM based. Let's go through some of the presets. I've walked you through 5 or 6 different virtual FM synthesizers. At the same time, I've tried to relate how the evolution of FM synthesis has affected the design and construction of those newer synths. And as an FM junkie, I think you have to ask yourself, how many different sources of FM synthesis do you actually need? Do they all sound the same? Do they do the same things? Or are they unique in some way? And I think one of the factors is whether you're a preset guy like me, or whether you're doing sound design and you want to control all the parameters to create your own sounds. Certainly, everything after Native Instruments FM8, including Tracktion EFM and the OP-X4, do a great job of laying out all the parameters that you can use in sound design. So if programming your own sounds is important, then looking at the latest options and buying those might be your best strategy. Another important factor here is really just the essence of that frequency modulation sound. It is consistent over all of the demos that I've given here. I've gone over lots of presets so you get an idea of what FM is good at. Certainly when the emphasis has been on recreating acoustic sounds like strings or brass or guitar, sampled instruments have dominated. And that's not really the goal we've been talking about here. It's coming up with creative, deep, textured sounds that adds something to your music and your style. Putting together this video was a bit of an experiment for me because it forced me to really dive into what's out there, how does it work, where do I get my sounds. If you found this useful, click on the like button. Consider subscribing to the channel. Subscribing to the channel does help promote what I do and it keeps me going. But most importantly, if you have feedback, add your comments. I like to create a dialogue and I like to gather information from my audience. So if you have some thoughts, feel free to add a comment. Thanks for watching.